Hi everyone and welcome to my channel and to this video where I'm gonna share with you lots of different tips for painting grass. It's one of the things that I've always struggled with. I might have spent hours painting a beautiful dog portrait and then really struggled to capture the grass that they're sitting on. So in this video I want to share several tips on how to create realistic looking grass. Whether it's super detailed and up close to the grass, or it's more painterly and impressionistic. There are many different tips that I can give you in this video. I hope that you enjoy this and you find it helpful. If you do find it helpful, then please do hit the subscribe button here on YouTube and hit the little bell button so that you get notified every time I make a new video. And if you'd like even more in-depth tuition in soft pastel, then consider checking me out on my Patreon channel where you'll get access to my full catalogue of real-time tutorials and lots more. But I hope that you enjoy this. So I'm going to use a few different paintings that I've created over the last few years and show you some footage and some ideas from each one on how I created the effect I was going for. The first one that I'm going to look at is this giant painting which I've just completed, and it involves all sorts of greenery. We've got lots of leaves, lots of flowers, this spiky tall grass in the background, right through to this large area of grass at the bottom. And I'm going to show you some ideas on how to deal with areas like this that are so repetitive and could end up taking you hours and hours to complete. So I want to show you a few little hacks and tricks in this video to help you speed up the process of creating realistic looking grass. Because whether it's a pet portrait or a wildlife painting, there are many places that you might encounter grass in your painting, and to me those background elements can really make or break a good painting. So let's have a look at some of the footage from this and some other of my projects which included grass. You might find this type of grass in a lot of pet portraits where the animal has been photographed in their garden. It's usually a shorter grass that has been cut, and I find it useful in many portraits. This example shows a large area of grass and how it should come up over the paws of the animals. It also shows light and shade, and I've already thought about the shadow line while blocking in the black. I want really dark contrast in between the grass blades, especially in the shadows. I trust that the pastel matte paper here will allow the lighter greens on top of this black. So not filling in quite as strongly where the sunlight area is going to be. Giving each layer a good rub into the paper as well. Then I work my way up in tonal value on the dark greens to begin with, making these medium length strokes and building it up from background to foreground. When I add the next layers, I'm sometimes adding a new grass blade, and sometimes I'm just adding colour or changing the shape of an existing one. I try not to make the marks too uniformed, and I keep moving around and filling in the gaps so that it looks more random and therefore natural. The only thing to change in the sunlit area are my colour choices. Greens with more yellow content, but keeping my marks the same as in the shadow. And remember, this is cut grass, so you don't need to make a fine point at the top of each blade. The pastel stick can provide a good enough blunt edge that works well. So now for something different. This is more patchy grass with leaves and other plants and foliage showing through. The clumps of grass do have pointed tops, and they sprout out in all directions. This time I've also blocked in the dark earth that I want to shine through the brighter greens. And I've used black, but also a lovely Terry Ludwig colour that I love. It's one of the dark eggplant colours. Then I might be filling in lots of different shapes in amongst the grass. So leaves, later on you'll see some moss, and all the time making sure that, especially around the base of the dog, I go really dark in there. So I really take my time forming these foreground blades of grass. The further away I go in the composition, the less detail I can add and get away with it and create some depth as well. But here in the foreground, I do give each blade a bit of thought in its shape. And you can see that the chunky piece of Unison Pastel makes the perfect width for each blade of grass. Using a green with a lot of yellow content here, just to dapple in some little bits of moss. Then with my highlights, I'm really choosy about how much of each blade of grass to highlight. So you want to remember that these curved pieces of grass are only really catching the light in probably one area on their curve. So especially towards the root of the grass, you'd expect it to be darker in there. So avoid bringing any highlight colours in close to the roots. And even within the shadows, I try to bring in some warm reds and brown earths. It always helps if you can inject a bit of complementary colour in there. But also, if you look at the photo reference, you can see some dead grass and roots and things that are actually sending out a lot of red and dark browns. And then the final step on this piece was to use one of these Pan Pastel soft blenders. And I love that I can use the point of this just to darken in at the base of some of the roots, to shape some leaves, and just to generally do a little bit of blending. And you can see that when you start to smear the pastel pigment, it starts to look a lot like paint. So, short receding grass. This is an even easier way to deal with grass. I'll start with this German Shepherd in mid-length grass, but only really in the foreground. The idea with this type of grass is to enhance depth and where our focus should be. So I start with sticks on their sides, filling in and using broader strokes. And again, I'm working from background to foreground, usually blocking in the darks, or especially around the base of the animal. And then starting to bring in some more mid-tone greens, working my way again up through the tonal values. Sometimes with this kind of grass, I like to create a little bit of blur along the front as well. So I don't necessarily continue the level of detail that's around the dog. And that is an effect that sometimes happens when you're taking a photo, that you get a lot of soft focus in the background, but also a little bit in the foreground too. And I love using that effect, partly because it looks really nice, and also because it saves me having to go into much detail on several parts of this grass. I really only have to create grass right in around the base of the dog. So it gets me away with having to paint too much grass that's in detail. So just doing a little bit more work around the foreground and finally bringing in some little vibrant touches of colour on the tips of the grass. Now the German Shepherd there was on uncut grass receding into the distance. This time let's take a look at a lawn of cut grass. It was so lovely and misty when I went to photograph these two dogs for their portrait, and I really wanted to capture that in their painting. You can see here that at the base I block in a thin layer of mid-tone green. And around the base of the dogs in their shadows, I use a very dark purple. You'll see me use purple in shadows on grass a lot. I add in both darker and lighter marks and also bring in some touches of brown earths, both in the light and the shade. I find if you really think about colour, there is a lot that you can get away with. This is by no means photorealistic grass, but I think I get away with it. This is a grass area that I did soon after that last one, and I used some of the lovely Misty colours at the top of the painting. I wanted this to be simple, and what I was really trying to do was improve on the photo reference which you can see to the top right. It's just a concrete yard, but I thought that with the lovely crisp shadow shape, it might look nice on some grass. So on this one, I'm using much shorter marks. And the length of the marks is really receding into the distance. As you come forward in the piece, I use slightly longer marks. And I use purple again in the shadows. The shadow is really strong and contrasted to the sunlit areas. And with my lighter marks in the sunlit areas, I start to shape the edge of the shadow. Don't forget, if you're looking down on the subject matter slightly, like in this one, the blades of grass will look shorter because when you look at grass from up above, you're seeing a foreshortened view of each blade of grass. So I was happy to leave each little mark and stroke in this one extremely short and impressionistic. And again, it's important to bring some blades of grass up over the paws and the lower parts of the dog that are touching the grass, just to really sink them into the grass and make it look more realistic. If you want to watch this entire tutorial in real time with color codes and narration, I actually have this one for free here on my YouTube channel, so be sure to check that out afterwards. It's a very useful tutorial as I've managed to use this one even in a portrait where we are slightly looking down on the girl. And you can go into even less detail like here. It never really comes into focus at the bottom of the painting, which really sets the dog apart. Again, I'm blocking in a mid-tone green using the side of the pastel for broader marks. My next layer is bringing in some darker and mid-tone greens, making some texture across the grass, and again, the marks getting slightly shorter as we go towards the back of the composition. The lighter marks that come in on top add more to the texture, and finally a few flowers dotted about the foreground, not much detail in them, but even less in the background where they are merely little dots. Now this kind of grass features both in gardens and in the wild. This is where things get tricky. This is where you need bags of patience and to accept that it is going to take a while. Unlike before, each blade of grass needs some attention and can't be finished in one stroke. I use a hard black pastel to block in the darker shapes. Again, the contrast is necessary for those greens to shine out later on. But I really use this stage with the black pastel to do a lot of my planning of where leaves and grass is going to overlap each other. And then I come in with the darker greens like before and start to block in some of the shapes. There may even be several greens on one blade of grass in this type of piece. But mainly I'm blocking in the darks and working up through the tonal values. But the main difference with this type of grass when you're painting it is how much time and attention each individual blade of grass requires. And especially those that are most prominent, for example, when it cuts across the dog, I want to give that part real attention. I can always use pastel pencils to neaten up the edges. But then once I'm finished with the blocking in stages and I've got some mid-tone greens on there too, I start to come in with the lighter colours and pick out the highlights along the edges. So there really are several stages to this type of grass, and it is a lot more laborious. So again, using the pastel pencil just to refine the edges and make sure those little sections of darkness are really crisp. So beware of bluebells. If you ever have to paint bluebells up close, you can expect to spend a lot of time on it. Another example of bluebells is this piece with two lovely schnauzers in it. It was so complicated, but I tried to create some depth of field here too and give more focus to the dogs in the foreground. Again, I worked from background to foreground, layering up the grass as it gets closer to you. And finally, back to where we started with this piece. Blocking in again and planning out with the black. This part is always slow because I'm studying the photo reference a lot, choosing out the most prominent blades of grass and choosing what I'm going to include in the painting. And like every other time that I've showed you here, I'm using a harder black pastel just so that it doesn't smudge around quite as much. I have good control with these harder edged pastels, and I'll add links to all of the materials that I use in the description below. Don't forget also that all of the painting footage that you've seen in this video actually has a full-length tutorial. So if you'd like to learn from any of these in real time, along with colour codes and my narration all the way through, you can access all of those via my Patreon channel. Again, I'll add links in the description below, as well as to my free grass video here on YouTube. So the darker greens now start to fill in the gaps and create some of the long blades of grass. It's always the same technique really, planning it out and blocking in the darkest contrasted areas with the black, starting with the darker greens to fill in some gaps and block in some of the blades, and working right up in tonal value until I'm bringing in some lighter greens and starting to layer it up and create depth. Focus a lot on areas that overlap each other, and even if you don't create detail all the way across, just by picking out a few prominent blades of grass that nicely cut across, creating a woven effect in some places. So I'm always coming back in, darkening down areas, especially towards the roots, refining the edges of certain blades of grass. The mid-tone greens, creating as many crisscrosses as I can within the blades of grass. And you can see that I've been using lovely dark blue greens when it's in shadow. And then I start to bring in a more yellow based green for midtones and highlights. The highlights on this section are sparse. Sometimes there's a gap where a shadow cuts across it. This can be really fiddly to do, but it's usually worth the effort. And then again, I want to darken down towards the base here. The greens on this type of long grass are usually going to be lighter and with more yellow in them the further up you go. So right down at the base there, I'm just keeping it to those lovely dark blue greens. So your colour choices are one of the most important elements of painting grass. And I kid you not, this type of grass takes every ounce of my patience, but it can be oddly satisfying. As I've shown you, there are easier ways to create different grasses. Bluebells are beautiful, but perhaps from a distance. If you have the patience for it, then you can see that all sorts of detail is possible in pastel. But you can also see that you don't need detail to create realistic grass. So as you can see from all of those examples, there are many times when you can avoid going into huge amounts of detail on your areas of grass. And hopefully this video gives you some ideas on how to tackle that in your own paintings. Honestly, I've never enjoyed painting grass. But after a while of being a pet portrait artist, I realised it was something I was going to keep encountering and I was going to have to get on board with it. So I hope that some of the ideas in this video make it seem a little bit more doable to you. It would be really helpful to me if you could hit the subscribe button here on YouTube to show me some support. Also consider checking me out on my Patreon channel where you'll find lots and lots of real-time tutorials all about soft pastel. And you can now browse all of the real-time tutorials that I have available on my Patreon channel by visiting emmacolbertart.com. I'll add all of these links in the description below. But thanks very much for watching this, and until next time, happy pasteling.